very much. I'd also like to thank the organizers of the conference for the opportunity to be here. I'm excited to share some of my thoughts about my work with you. In some ways, the title of my talk, Writing a Democratic Narrative of Accountability, seems like it shouldn't be necessary. I've been doing research on the effects of government tests on teaching, learning, schools, classrooms for many decades now, since the early 1980s. In my early research, looked at the impact of testing, and the uses of standardized testing were certainly significant, and I could never have imagined the way things would develop over the last number of decades. In particular, it would have been impossible in the 80s to imagine that student test scores would become essentially a single indicator of what defines quality, both in terms of student learning as well as teacher performance and schools. It would have been inconceivable to imagine that test scores would be the indicator that's valued, in spite of the fact that we know that test scores have severe limitations to what they tell us about student learning. Or that this logic would be so compelling in spite of the fact that it is nonsensical in many ways. And part of what I want to talk about today is that nonsensicalness. The ways in which the uses of test scores and accountability more generally have dramatically altered the landscape of public education. So after doing research for many decades, it seems that we need to find a way to return to a more democratic approach. So my own frustration, I think, in terms of the limited success that we've had in eschewing what I think are the dysfunctional and anti-public education policies and strategies is grounded, I think, in part in the amazing staying power of neoliberalism. And we really need to think about and understand neoliberalism better than we have. If we're in fact hopeful that we might create some change. Everyone in this room knows what neoliberalism is. It's not what I'm going to talk about specifically, but I do want to dwell on it just for a couple of minutes. Not to talk about what it is, but to talk about why it is so overwhelming and compelling. We all in this room and beyond work valiantly to overthrow neoliberalism so that we can save public schools, and especially to maintain public education as a public good rather than a commodity. So we do at least two things. We engage in research. I suspect we could fill the Earth's oceans with the volume of research that's done, that both chronicles and analyzes, and maybe most importantly, critiques the very pernicious impact of neoliberalism on education. We engage in political action of local and large-scale nature. Examples like the protests of Occupy Education, which grew out of the Occupy movement. We lobby legislation, we vote for people that we hope will in some way change the nature of neoliberalism's impact on schools. But frankly, we haven't been very successful. Neither rational analyses nor shouting seem to have much impact on educational policies that are driven by neoliberalism. At least in North America, there is a sort of desire to see neoliberalism as something that we can set aside. And so there are increasing cries that neoliberalism is dead. And in fact, one of the fundamental tenets of neoliberalism, everyone agrees is unworkable, and that's essentially the notion of free markets. However, neoliberalism lives on. It doesn't go away. Neoliberalism, as an ideology, seems to have plenty of tricks up its metaphoric sleeve. It reinvents itself at the drop of a hat, and let me give you an example. In the United States, neoliberalism undergirded the passage of legislation which you may have heard of, No Child Left Behind, the reauthorization of the federal education legislation, and a clear example in its creation of the conflation of capitalism, politics, and federal regulation. That legislation has been in place long enough that now people can clearly say it didn't work. One might think that would be the demise of such approaches to educational reform, but in fact, within the neoliberal context, the legislation gets reinvented. So No Child Left Behind has been followed up in the United States with a new piece of legislation called Race to the Top. Race to the Top is essentially a contest in which the states in the United States are awarded points for satisfying certain educational policies. So if they do the things that the federal government wants, they get points for it. Such things as performance-based standards for both teachers and principals, implementing and complying with the nationwide curriculum standards, what in the US is called the Common Core, and promoting charter schools within school districts, and essentially the privatization of education. So while one piece of legislation motivated by neoliberalism, it doesn't work, it comes back in multiple different forms. So even though choice, competition, and accountability as educational reform levers aren't working, they get dressed up in different clothes and are promulgated once again by the government and the capitalists with whom they work. So in this example of No Child Left Behind replaced by Race to the Top, what you see is that neoliberalism doesn't lead to deregulation, but instead re-regulation in simply a different form. So the question then becomes, why does neoliberalism have such staying power? Well, in part, I think the definition of neoliberalism is sufficiently slippery that it can absorb many criticisms and much opposition and can continually reinvent itself without any problem. I think the other difficulty is that critics sometimes forget that neoliberalism is not about the withdrawal of the state, but it is about the reinvention of the state, and that doesn't go away. So it is a use of state resources not for public welfare, as in the past, but now for corporate welfare. So that we see as the state bails out corporations on the one hand, it implements austerity measures for the rest of us on the other hand. So I want you to consider a couple of different ideas that help me to put into perspective why it is that neoliberalism isn't going away for us. This first quote, and I won't read it, you can read it, I'll talk about it, is from Václav Havel. And the it that he refers to in this quote is the post-totalitarian state in Czechoslovakia. And in his famous essay, Power of the Powerless, Havel talks about this post-totalitarian state. And this description is uncannily like what we might think of as the power of neoliberalism in the present day. Another idea, and I'll conjoin these ideas, is, in the second case, the it that's referred to here is Gramsci's notion of hegemony. Neoliberalism is, in some ways, the secularized religion that Havel refers to, and its hypnotic charm facilitates its hegemonic character in a Gramscian sense. This idea is consistent with what Dave Harvey calls naturalization, the idea that neoliberal ideas are incorporated into the common sense way we interpret, live in, and understand the world. So, in some senses, we think of neoliberalism as a noun. When we conjoin Havel's notions along with Gramsci's notion of hegemony, we can begin to think about not just neoliberalism, but neoliberalization. Think of it as a process, that it is a flexible, slippery, malleable idea that allows itself to change and reformulate. Understanding neoliberalism as a process suggests that we need to see it as organic and regenerative, that it doesn't go away easily. It's a bit like bacteria. So there are lots of ways to explore neoliberalism as a process, but what I want to talk about is using narrative as an analytic framework. So narratives are stories that we tell. We tell them out loud and to ourselves. We tell them to each other in an individual way, but we also tell them collectively. Stories are about who we are as a group as well. The stories create and recreate and make sense of the social world. It's one of the fundamental things that we as humans do. So stories include characters. Typically in a story, characters confront some kind of crisis, seeking solutions, or at least crises. Narratives are fundamental and powerful ways of making sense. They both provide the possibility of limiting and liberating our senses of what the world is. So narratives are often hegemonic in a Gramscian sense, but as Gramsci reminds us, we're not merely victims of narratives. We can retell those stories, rewrite those stories to overcome that hegemony. So we could analyze neoliberalism as a narrative. I want to focus a little more particularly in the rest of my remarks on what I'm going to call a narrative of accountability in education. Why focus on that part of neoliberalism? Well, accountability is in large part the enforcement mechanism. It's the strategy that both sustains and facilitates a neoliberal ideology. So what is this neoliberal narrative of accountability in education? This is a story that's recreated by many people, many interests, many agencies. And as a story, this narrative is filled with a drama of failing schools, a drama of inadequate education. And these failures and inadequacies are multidimensional, so that the crisis in this story becomes a very difficult one. How do we see this playing itself out? Education is failing because countries don't have global competitiveness. Their workforces are not adequately prepared. There's not the brain power being developed. Education is failing because not everybody is performing well. At least in North America, this is characterized as what's called the achievement gap, often cast in either racial or ethnic terms. Education is failing because there's waste and incompetence in the schools. The complexity of the crisis actually serves to sustain the narrative that the crisis can only be partially resolved and perhaps never completely resolved, thus maintaining the strong narrative from a neoliberal perspective. Every story has villains and heroes. In ideological narratives particularly, someone or something must be blamed for the crisis. In the narrative of accountability, from a neoliberal perspective, those who are most culpable for the failure of education are usually teachers. Teachers are blamed pretty much across the board, and I think probably around the world, for being the cause of the failure of schools. That blame is a little diffuse. Oftentimes it extends and includes teachers' unions. The problem with schools is that you have unionism in the school, and that's what's creating bad schools. Or the idea of having state-sponsored schools. So when governments get involved in schooling, of course they fail. So it spreads out a little bit, but the central source from a neoliberal perspective is that teachers are the ones who are the problem. Those are the villains in this neoliberal narrative. Who are the heroes? The heroes in a neoliberal narrative are, at least first and foremost, an idea. So the idea that education and schooling are services that consumers, particularly parents, can choose from is one of those saving ideas. Schools need to be freed from the state. They need to be managed better. Schooling needs to be reconceptualized as a commodity. And if all that happens, then failing schools will go away. But of course, we remember that in this narrative of accountability, schooling, even as a private good, can never be accomplished without the state regulations that reinforce the very existence of the crisis that's meant to be solved in the first place. There are also human heroes in this narrative. Typically, capitalists who know nothing about schools and education, but who have access to both money and, importantly, the media. Some of those capitalists hide behind their foundations, oftentimes dressed up as philanthropic foundations, although some are happy to be personally identified. In the United States, perhaps one of the key heroic figures in the neoliberal narrative who's going to save education is Bill Gates. Others are disguised as research-informed think tanks. In my own country, Canada, we have one called the Fraser Institute. And there are other heroes as well. In the United States, we see politicians like Barack Obama, great hope that people had when he was elected the first time, and his Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan. Those are the sort of heroes in this narrative who will save schools from being abysmal failures. I'd like to suggest that the narrative of accountability from a neoliberal perspective is stuck in the middle of a story that appears to solve the crisis, but in fact sustains the crisis in order to ensure that the power of neoliberalism does not go away. So if we look, this is a little, if for any of you English teachers, you will recognize this. It's a kind of traditional way of thinking about a story. A story is a beginning and a middle and an end. This neoliberal narrative of accountability is one that maintains the crisis. It makes the middle of the story the end of the story. So it's a never-ending story that can be sustained over time. Now, if I'm right, and this narrative is hegemonic, then it's a story that's repeatedly told, it's affirmed and reaffirmed in indirect ways, and it's told by particular kinds of people. And I want to just show you pretty quickly from my own experience a kind of example of how the people who tell the story matter, and they create different potential narratives. So this is just a list in my province, British Columbia in Canada, of educational policy players. But not all of these storytellers are part of the narrative. So if I do this, I take away the people who really have little voice and leave the people who sustain this neoliberal narrative. You have the government. I'll come back to the fact that the teachers' union is there. You have the conservative think tank, in my country, the Fraser Institute. You have the media. And in this case, we have the teachers' union as well. The teachers' union, although they're very opposed to the kind of neoliberal reforms, by their engagement with particularly the Fraser Institute and the media, actually work to contribute to the sustenance of this narrative. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So if I switch this up and said, what if we had a more democratic narrative of accountability? Same initial group of players, but take away different ones, and we now have potentially storytellers who could create a different kind of narrative about what accountability is. So the teachers are there, parents and think tanks, and the more left-leaning think tanks that exist. So a democratic narrative of accountability might look something like this. In some ways, it's kind of the obverse of what a neoliberal narrative is. And you can see that there. I'm not going to say a whole lot more about it. I want to, because I only have a couple minutes left, skip ahead to say, how can this narrative be created? We actually have to have some strategies for doing that. And I borrowed again from Havel's work, and he talks about two strategies. One he calls small works, and one he calls parallel structures. So the notion of small works is really the idea that we can, in our individual lives, engage in resisting what Havel called living within a lie. And that we do that by engaging in a kind of critique that is meaningful to us, and it may take many different forms, different for each of us, but things like refusing to comply, organizing, public acts of resistance. Out of these small works, which are really individual acts, might grow these parallel structures that Havel talked about. That these are possible ways that coalesce around individual acts and create the opportunity for different organizational alternatives, for example, homeschooling, free schooling, charters. I might just add that charter schools, for example, are oftentimes perceived to be the instrument of neoliberalism. In fact, they're not. It's just that neoliberals have been quite successful at using this notion of parallel structure. Or alternative practices as well, and I've given a couple of examples there. In very pragmatic terms, we really need to think about what kinds of strategies to use, and I've just listed some here, and let me just talk for a couple of minutes about one of them, which is the notion, okay, barricades. Barricading is an old form of resistance. It's been around a long time. It's, in some ways, physical barricading is less effective than it used to be, in part because barricading has become criminalized in many situations, and so it's difficult to do. So I want to use the idea metaphorically, ways in which we can create barricades within our own practice that resist a neoliberal narrative and may, as a consequence, contribute to this kind of democratic narrative. So let me just give a couple examples and then I will quit. So we might make, as individuals, independent decisions about what curriculum materials that we use. This might subvert, for example, Pearson's attempts to control knowledge, or an example that was given the other day talking about the Americanization of teacher education in Turkey. Teacher educators in Turkey could choose not to use the curriculum that is provided by the American version of what teacher education ought to be. We can do things like decide to reject the notion of competition among students by choosing ungraded approaches to evaluating student learning. And there are other examples, and I'd be happy to talk about them if there's time at the end. Just to sum, the idea of this is that sharing the notion of living within the truth rather than living within a lie has the potential, as it did in Havel's Czechoslovakia, to build a new narrative, a narrative that might ultimately result in the comparable Velvet Revolution in education. Thank you.
I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for organizing such an important event. But mainly, from this podium, I'd like to thank Mine, Mukades, Sevin, Aishu, Sinem, Nurben, Esen, Perihan, Samet, Onur, Denis, Nursan, Deria, Ferhat, Aslan, Senay, Zeynep, Eda, Oslem, Fikret, Saziye. These are the following. This is an academic conference, and I came here as an academic. But also, I'm not only an academic, I am a member of a revolutionary anti-capitalist organization. So I cannot leave this part of myself outside of this hall and be just an academic. I am both. So, being a revolutionary communist, I want to say the following. I want to thank once more all the Turkish comrades that helped Greek revolutionaries during the 7-year junta we had in Greece for providing support, shelter and protection to our comrades fleeing from Greece and to Turkey in order to avoid the military oppression. At the same time, I want to pay tribute once more to our Turkish comrades that fled to Greece during the Evren dictatorship. To say once more that these comrades found shelter, refuge, hospitality, and a warm hug by us, the Greek revolutionaries. Especially, I want to mention the comrades of an organization that does not exist anymore, that was brutally suppressed and eliminated during the dictatorship, the comrades of Devion. So let's pay tribute to the comrades of Devion. Nowadays, we work very heavily in the support committees of Kurdish refugees in Greece, so that they are not extradited either to Germany or to Turkey because there is danger for their lives. Be sure that we do our best to protect Kurdish refugees in Greece. During all these years of conversation and discussions that we had with the Turkish left, we know very well and we came to the conclusion that we have to build a strong unity between the Greek left, the Greek revolutionary left, and the Turkish revolutionary left. We know very well that we have to fight together against the nationalism of our own bourgeoisies. We have to fight together that in order for socialism to become possible in this southeastern area of Europe and the Middle East, in order for socialism to become a viable perspective for the whole of Europe, it is necessary to build strong unity among Greek and Turkish workers. So, from this point of view, once more, as in the past, I want to say, Γεια σας in Turkey, Vegunanistan is Kilerin Biligi. And now, on the academic part. So, of course, such a topic, critical science education, critical resistance, critical knowledge acquisition cannot be developed and fully analyzed in 20 minutes, that's why, or less now after my political intervention. Therefore, I will concentrate mainly on the issue of critical knowledge. So, we have to ask why a discussion on knowledge is important. It is important first for political reasons. Comrade Trotsky, during his conversation with the American left in the 30s, and during his letter exchanging with the minority of the American Socialist Workers' Party in a letter to Eastman, 6 November 1933, he said, he wrote in this letter, I don't know of a single case when a disagreement in the area of philosophy, and more precisely epistemology and method, did not lead to political disagreements. And in fact, the whole exchange of ideas about the class nature of the USSR in the 30s, at the end result was a fierce debate over dialectics and the nature of knowledge. Second, drawing from Ernest Mandel's late capitalism. Comrade Ernest Mandel, in this monumentous work, he writes explicitly that technological revolutions are the steam engines of late capitalism. At this stage of capitalism, we are passing through the third technological revolution, which is the revolution of computing and automation. But this third technological revolution had a profound effect which the other two technological revolutions, the steam engine and the electricity, did not have. The third technological revolution had the result of proletarianizing intellectual labor and bringing intellectual labor at the same level of exploitation as manual labor. So, this type of capitalism, this phase of capitalism is, okay, some people call it cognitive capitalism. I will not subscribe fully to such a terminology, but what is the main point that we have to have in mind is that this type of capitalism is characterized by the accumulation of knowledge, which becomes the basic source of value. Moreover, because of the proletarianization of intellectual labor, we have the appearance of a new knowledge economy which reshapes the division of labor, favoring the emergence of a horizontal structure in the production. This horizontal structure in the production becomes possible through the development of intelligence systems, digital intelligence systems, virtual networks such as the internet. So I recall what George Brolios said the other day when he said that we have not a pyramid, but we have an anti-hierarchical organization of the labor process, and in fact this becomes possible and takes shape in the horizontal organization of labor through the internet and the intelligence systems. Internet becomes a means of production. At the same time, some bourgeois economists say that this new phase of capitalism is not going to undergo any crisis. But the theory of crisis is based on overproduction, on overproduction and the exploitation of labor power. In this period, we are not talking only about exploitation of the labor power, but we are talking also about the exploitation of the invention power of the collective subject, but also of the individual. So we are at a new phase where we have the production of knowledge by means of knowledge, like in the previous stage of mercantile capitalism, we have the production of commodities by means of commodities, and at the first stage of late capitalism, we had production of means of production by means of production. So, at the same time, and this was also mentioned yesterday, we have attempts from production of knowledge by the social movements. And I will refer to the case of the World Social Forum. After the Sao Paulo Forum, there was a committee established under the directorship of Dos Santos Souza by the World Social Forum in order to produce the alternative strategies of the movements, of the world social movements against capitalism, against the capitalists. So the result was the production of 5 volumes about the alternative ways of production, the alternative ways of thinking. The third volume is exclusively refers to knowledge, and it is called Another Knowledge is Possible. I would not go into many details about this. It is very interesting to analyze this proposal by the World Social Forum. The characteristic is, which I strongly disagree, is let's say a horizontal division between North and South, between Northern epistemologies and Southern epistemologies, which are in conflict. And the Northern epistemologies, the theory of knowledge, is standard imperialistic, and within the framework of Northern epistemologies, mainstream left thinking is incorporated into Northern epistemologies. So my criticism is that if this is not the way to go forward, and that's why the notion of critical knowledge and critical knowledge production acquires a very big importance. So, therefore, to summarize up to now, knowledge is the main resource of late capitalism, and the production of new knowledge is compatible with liberal governmentality. I would refer, it has been said in the previous days about the documents of the European Union on education. They employ this terminology. And at the same time, knowledge production and emancipatory research can be an integral part of activist practice and social movements, and today are more prevalent than ever. We have the example of the World Social Forum, what has happened, but we have to build on that and go forward. Now, let's theorize about the notion of critical knowledge. I will start with Habermas, knowledge and human interest, which is the contribution of theory, Aristotle, and the human aspect. Okay. The contribution of Habermas is very important because he moved theory of knowledge from the analytic tradition to critical theory tradition. In fact, one of his topics in this book is theory of knowledge as a social theory. In fact, in a passage of his book, he says critical social theory is a form of self-reflective knowledge. And he also, there is a periodicity in academic there's always a tendency, I think, in literature to have periods and analyze in terms of periods, different types and forms of knowledge, whatever. Friedrich Jensen's work about capitalism and the production of space, making a periodicity of space, more or less along the same lines that Habermas does in his theory of knowledge. So, I just read the central point about the kinds of knowledge and the corresponding research methods who have instrumental knowledge, practical knowledge, and emancipation knowledge, which is reflection, corresponding to cognitive scientists, interpretive research, and critical social science. Now, for the Marxist theory of knowledge, I will make a brief review of the Marxist theory of knowledge. The subject was really very hot in the 80s and 90s. I will just recall Marxism material in a study Marxist theory of knowledge by David Hiller and Marxist theory of scientific knowledge by Patrick Murray, which I think that these are the two most important theoretical contributions from a Marxist perspective to the theory of knowledge. And I will elaborate further on our comrade, my comrade Ernest Mandel's thesis of knowledge in his work, The Case of Marxist Utopia. he draws both from the analytic tradition and the critic and the Frankfurt school. So I would say that Mandel is a special intellectual in the tradition of critical scientific rationalism. And of course, knowledge, reality can exist independently of our ideas. Reality is objective. The process of cognition is an objective process. Mandel has been heavily translated in Turkish, as you can see. Thought and truth are both absolute. Okay, truth is not absolute. Truth is always approximate. And the ultimate criterion for the veracity of thought and of science consequently is practical. But he says at the end that knowledge is scientific insofar as its explanation can be used to predict what does not yet exist, to integrate interpretation into the interpretation of the real process considered as a whole, therefore not reductionistic, and at the same time to alter and transform reality in line with the pre-established goal. And what is the advantage of the Marx theory of knowledge in relation to other theorizations in this notion that knowledge is scientific, knowledge can be objective as long as it can alter and transform reality according to a pre-established goal. Now, in our field in critical pedagogy, okay, we are not in vacuum, okay, and the space is not scarcity, because in 2007-2008, John Kitchener published this book, Knowledge and Critical Pedagogy. In fact, I will subscribe to late Joe's idea that knowledge and the theory of knowledge is the key to develop critical pedagogy. In his book, Joe sets up a critique about on the analytic tradition. He put forward the term fidurot, and fidurot stands for the initial letters of that knowledge in the analytic tradition is formal, intractable, decontextualized, universalistic, reductionistic, and one-dimensional. And he proposes critical complex, what he terms critical complex epistemology, CCE, according to these premises that knowledge is socially constructed, consciousness is a social construction, that power plays an important role in the production of knowledge and consciousness, that we have to understand consciousness, and he proposes the work of Lev Vygotsky, and at the same time is up, okay, we have to unite logic and emotion in knowledge production. In fact, then he proposes 10 areas, or how many there? 9 areas of research, directions of research for the field of knowledge in critical pedagogy. You see, I will finish. Okay, I will finish in a moment. Okay. So he proposes, these areas of research. I will just make a comment that understanding the fourth one, understanding our location in the tangled web of reality. This is drawn from Friedrich Jameson. Friedrich Jameson put forward the term cognitive mapping, and the term cognitive mapping is exactly what Joe proposes in this fourth. And at the same time, the last one, critical ontology, draws heavily of our fellow physicist, late David Bohm, on quantum ontology, okay, the new identities and so on. So, is critical knowledge production possible? We have, there are some prerequisites that we have to start from the fact that the cognitive process establishes a conceptual autonomy from the existing forms of social consciousness, that historically, so there is an autonomous formation of a conceptual framework at the time of knowledge production, but historically there is a social conflict over the appropriation and or suppression of this new knowledge that is being produced. Knowledge or the suppression of knowledge depends on the balance of social forces locally and internationally. So whether the knowledge will be emancipatory, will be critical, or will be compatible with cognitive capitalism, will be appropriated by the forces of capital. This depends by the class struggle at the site of production of knowledge and internationally. In fact, my conclusion is that it is important that scientific research, that means the place where knowledge is produced, is articulated with the activist practices of social movements, taking into account the newly developed democratic strategies of knowledge production based on the premise of equality and the expertise of every single individual. So, comrades, the philosophers have interpreted the world. We have not to stay on this, we have also to change it. Thank you for your attention.
Everyone, here Ankara University on hosts, and for your warmth and courage, generosity and intelligence. It's just been fantastic. I'd like to say a special thanks to Professors Ahmet, Fauzier, Marat, who helped so much in pulling this together, and students, Daria, Aisu, and for me particularly Zeynep, who was so kind to forgive me for accidentally kidnapping her computer. My talk is my talk is titled "On the Waiting List," and it has a subtitle which is "Thank you for your interest in Freire." And again, please excuse my bad Chicago English. On the left, one of the many dreams, is the withering away of the state. And we do need to be careful how and what we wish for. We may be left with a corporate royalty and their digital form of neo-feudalism, as I thought I heard Costas maybe referred to. My focus is on education reform, loosely called school choice. I wish to argue here that at least one element of school choice, privatization, rather, at least one element of privatization, school choice, and a related expression, school attendance sweepstakes, gambling on whether you can get your child into school. Our avatars predict the paralysis of all social rights. They were to distract attention from the expropriation of the Commonwealth interest in fair public education. Achieving bourgeois middle-class status means one can afford a private education for children, your children. Status anxiety is the chief driver of the school choice movement, and the function of the contingencies of choice and now chance both mystify and misdirect, shrouding the slippage of petty bourgeois life chances. That is the focus of this work, the so-called choices in schooling. I write here to continue explorations in this direction and the hypnosis, that is the ideological sleight of hand, which has refocused middle-class anxiety away from their economic and status anxieties. I would like to extend studies of Guy Debord, my namesake, in the Society of the Spectacle, as he reflects on the communicative media of global Americanization and what he called the diffuse spectacle. Wayne was speaking of Debord yesterday in a meaningful way. Education is focused on desire for fairness, for a meaningful commonwealth. However, there's a political struggle wherever property and life is at stake. This struggle occurs on the so-called field of reason, out in the open, where political knowledge and ideological sophistication helps those properly equipped to ferret out, as we say, or dig out profit for their children. Hardships inherited by the remnants of feudalism, monopoly capitalism, and racism have not been overcome, but reasonably well managed until recently. Chance, that old surrealist standby, so dangerous, so addictive, is added to fantasy, which makes the current play in public education so spectacular. It's so rich and refreshing to the public taste. Choice and chance are the stars of this season's show, and they threaten to overshadow standards and testing, which have not gone away. Debord describes this proliferation of master plans, national master plans in the U.S. as one of the drivers of movements today. Master plans like the U.S. Defense Education Act, the Nation at Risk, now the Common Core, the Race to the Top. These have been under-discussed as Marshall Plans. Although we have some of our speakers who know and have written on this. Central to these master plans has been their ability to hide what is important. Central to the human possibility of education is the capacity to disclose and nurture the soil for developing and uncovering truths. Essential to this would be the manifestation of the publicity regarding the division of labor in modern capitalism, which is the source of suffering and struggle, and the spectacle. This division is both occult and magical. Implicit in each master plan is the order that children become better fitted to the means of production, especially the incessant manufactured redundancy and capitalist theft of surplus labor value, masquerading as liberating technological innovation. Extended proletarianization, not expansion of human potential. I'm going to move out of, for a moment, from extended discussion of neoliberalism in order to move into more careful discussion of, I hope, ideology, and then into the charter movement. And first I'll say, when I look at these institutions, I want to describe them briefly. These are privately governed schools. They are called charter schools. They operate largely in secret. They select their students largely secretly. they govern secretly. They take public money, and that's part of our issue. Many critical scholars have debated the relationship between economy and ideology as dual drivers of school reforms and policies, roughly between the reproductionist positions and early Bolzaninists, Althusser's analyses of ideology formation. When situating neoliberalism, we have to think very carefully about the extent to which, beyond the mechanics of ideology, we look at the marvelous in ideology and the addictive powers and the consciousness-boosting powers of current digital conditions and current conditions of what might be called a magical realism and intoxication with innovation. Choice and these schools operates as a new dark market of social exception. This doctrine fits well into neoclassical economics, where the behavioral assumption is that everyone is free to choose. However, as Wisman notes, varying powers which condition this freedom are occult. The formation of preferences is ignored. The degree to which parents have differing powers to make a choice is ignored. And those powers are conditioned by their position in the division of labor. For the affluent, this is an advantage. And it is for the petty bourgeois, whose influence began to wane in the past generation. It's been a strong attraction. Their tremendous status hunger. And yet their children's rights to a free, fair public education are isolated from their own private property rights, the parents' private property rights. This is something that needs to be discussed more. A tax, my own town of Flagstaff, Arizona, and Washington, D.C. The lotteries. You enter your child in a lottery. You enter them praying that they will get picked. As you've all known, many of you know, and some of you saw Waiting for Superman. One way to miss the lottery, though, is to get stuck with a parent that can't manufacture a way to get the interview at the school, which may occur only 3 times a year. The very existence of lotteries, an active market for high status, is a marker of the way in which the child is at the mercy of the parent. This hyper-individualism and the division of parent and child rights is also central to this new era. He is waiting, this child is waiting to get on a waiting list to get into school with this sweepstakes. In more ways than one. They're waiting for a parent alienated from the school community who can't figure a way to get involved, to re-engage, or to engage. One who has been unwilling or unable to exercise choice. The child waits much more than the parent. Waiting for parents to get a different job schedule. Waiting for them to get a second car or a first car. Waiting for a good new school to be built. Because the good ones all have waiting lists. And one of the absorptive games of the choice movement is that, oh, like a supermarket, like a market, you want more grapes, we order more grapes and you have more grapes. You want more schools, we don't order more schools, we don't build them. It's a completely absurd use of the word market. Be careful what you wish for. Now, in this new reality, of choice. We have the support in our country of both parties, both of the major so-called parties, the support of the Obama administrations. These developments come as the result of a decades-long, roughly since the early 1970s, movement of capital through a variety of private, political, foundation, and commercial activities to rebrand the economic crisis as a crisis in education. This has been discussed here often. This activity has effectively used public education, however, as a diversion, a decoy, to target and take the eyes of the nervous public away from the increasing distance from the so-called American dream and from what might become a capitalist public relations crisis. This, I believe, is key. The use of education purely in an ideologically deforming manner to distract public anger and public fear. Your school is not fair. I can't get access to upward mobility like my father and mother could. I'm in a panic. I don't know how my children will pay their rent. I don't know. We're sorry. It was fair. It was fair. Well, I couldn't get on the waiting list. But it was fair. You gambled like everyone else. You just lost. This is key. What I want to argue centrally here is that we all think about the power of the invasion, of the taking all of the air out of all of our public rooms for the language of freedom written as the language of the Commonwealth, the language of our shared struggle and our sharing of our goods to educate all of our children, and the sly, sneaky, underhanded way that the invasion of private rights has occupied the notion of public rights. Suddenly, private rights, oh, you are struggling in this now approved Humean war of all against all. You're struggling. You just lost. It's natural that you lose. We are sorry. The naturalization of struggle has sucked the oxygen out of the room of our Commonwealth. That is the incredible power of the consciousness-twisting notion of replacing one form of rights with another. Now it's all private rights, but it's not only fair, but it's more fair because it moves out those inefficient Commonwealth discussions and replaces them with this robust and healthy, efficient, if social Darwinian language of victory and loss and struggle. And I'll conclude it so we can have a talk and conversation. You allow me just a second to there's a little comic relief here. And I'll find it in just a second. Although, given my luck in the last few days, I may not find it. Let me summarize. I discovered two schools, one in Philadelphia and one in Tucson, Arizona, a heartbeat away from the proto-fascist ascendance in my own state and in the U.S. Tucson has become an issue, but Paulo Freire Charter School in Philadelphia, the Paulo Freire Charter School in Tucson, and on the Paulo Freire website in Philadelphia. And if you would today, would you please Google it and look it up? Philadelphia, Paulo Freire Charter School. As Yogi Berra said, the great American baseball player, you could look it up. You will see. Thank you for your interest in Freire. We're sorry, but your child cannot get into the school because we have a waiting list. But you can get on the list if you come to our special meeting, and by extension, go through all the hurdles that I described earlier. So thank you for your interest in Freire. But we're sorry. We cannot allow your child to come to our school. I don't have to be overly specific about the irony in that. Tucson, same way. Sorry, but you cannot get in. Thank you for your interest in Freire. And I'll finish with a nervous middle-class parents blogging, and you can look them up. Look them up. They're blogging. What do I do? How do I get my kid into school in New Orleans, in Tucson? And they talk extensively in the research that I did all last year. Look, you have a few options. Sell your house. Sell your house. Whose parents is that claim made for? Well, those that can sell a house, those that have a house. Move to the area where the rent is too high for you to pay. Get your kid the chance then to get on the waiting list. So you're going to move, you're going to drive further to the job if you have one, and possibly get on the waiting list or not. And so, in the blog, one parent writes desperately, "Here's hoping. Here's hoping to luck. Our luck will continue. We met, luckily. If this luck continues, our children will both go to this charter school." Yes, here's to hoping, middle-class parents. Here's to hoping. And thanks for your interest in Freire.